I stood up in front of 200 strangers and offered to marry a woman I had never spoken a single word to in my whole life. I didn't do it for love, and I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because somebody in that room had to move, and by the time I looked around, it was painfully clear nobody else in that crowd of well-dressed people was ever going to. My name is Jack Halloway, and for 3 years I had been the man nobody looked at directly. I take care of the grounds at Cedar Hollow Vineyard, out in the hill country of Virginia, mending fences, running the tractor, keeping the vines alive through frost and drought. I build furniture on the side, cabinets and tables, whatever people trust me with. Most of them don't trust me with much. There's a scar that runs up my forearm and along my jaw, the kind you get when a house burns around you and you go back in for the person you love and come out with only the scar to show for it. My wife Sarah didn't come out at all. That was 3 years before the night I'm telling you about, and in a town as small as ours, people don't forget a thing like that. They don't say anything cruel to my face. They just stop meeting my eyes, like grief is contagious if you look at it too long. I got used to being furniture myself, the caretaker in the back, the man who strings the lights nobody thanks him for, the one who slips out the side gate before anyone thinks to offer him a plate. That was where I was standing on the night it happened, off to the side of the reception under the oaks I'd wired with string lights myself, watching 200 wedding guests laugh over wine I hadn't been invited to drink. I wasn't a guest. I was the help, technically, the man who kept the property looking right for the photographs, and I'd learned to be comfortable standing at the edges of other people's happiness. The bride's sister, a woman named Claire Whitfield, was sitting near the head table in a green dress, and I'd only noticed her because she kept glancing toward the exit like she was counting the steps to it, the way a person does when calculating an escape they don't believe they'll actually take. Then, Preston Cole stood up. I knew him the way everybody in that county did, the developer with his name on half the new construction between here and Charlottesville, a man who never had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He walked to Claire's table, dropped to one knee, and pulled a small velvet box from his jacket like the wedding had simply been a rehearsal for his own performance. I watched Claire's hands go still on the white tablecloth. I watched the smile she gave him crack right down the middle, the kind of smile you force onto your face when saying no isn't a choice life is actually letting you make. I'd seen that exact look before, on my own face, in a mirror, back when I'd smiled through things I had no power to refuse. Something in my chest moved before my mind ever caught up to it, the same something that had sent me back into a burning house for Sarah, the thing my father used to call sitting down on your own conscience and calling it manners. I felt my hand close around the old pocket watch I still carried in my jacket, the one engraved with his words, "Stand when it matters." Nobody at that reception knew my name. Nobody there had any reason to expect the caretaker by the oak trees to do anything but keep his head down and finish stringing the lights. I did not know yet what standing up that night was going to cost me, how much of the quiet, invisible life I'd built for myself I was about to lose. I only knew, with a certainty that scared me, that I could not stay in that chair 1 second longer. If a story about standing up for a stranger still matters to you, hit subscribe, because you will not want to miss where this one goes next. I walked across that lawn before I had a single word prepared, which is not something I recommend to anyone, and by the time I reached the head table, every face in the reception had turned to track me. 200 people going quiet in the space of about 4 seconds, forks stopping halfway to mouths, the string quartet losing the thread of whatever song it had been playing. Preston was still down on one knee, the ring held out, his jaw already tightening because he could read a problem walking toward him a full second before most people in that yard registered. I'd even moved from my chair. I looked at Claire, not at him, because it was never really him I was talking to, not once. I told her, plain as I could manage with my heart slamming against my ribs, that if a man had to corner a woman in front of 200 witnesses just to get an answer out of her, then whatever answer he got back didn't mean much of anything at all, and that she was free, as far as I was concerned, to marry somebody else entirely. Somebody like me, I said, since nobody in that yard had asked for my opinion, but I was giving it anyway. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and strange, the kind of silence a small town remembers for years afterward and repeats at diners for a decade. Preston's face went through 3 different colors before he found his footing again, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether to laugh it off as a joke or come at me swinging, and he chose the laugh, though it did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Claire looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has just done something no stranger has any business doing, somewhere between horror and the beginning of relief. Her father half rose from his seat near the front. Her sister, the bride, had both hands pressed over her mouth. Nobody in that crowd said a single word, and into that silence, Claire did something I did not expect and could not have planned for, even if I'd tried. She stood up, smoothed the front of her green dress, and walked straight toward me instead of toward him. We left together through the vineyard rows, past the string lights I'd wired myself 2 weeks earlier, past guests who parted like we were something contagious they didn't dare touch, and neither of us said a single word until we reached the old guest house at the far edge of the property, the one I kept locked and swept clean for visiting buyers who almost never came anymore, its porch light the only one still burning that far from the reception noise. I offered her the porch chair and took the step below it, putting a careful distance between us on pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept me at the edges of every gathering I'd attended since Sarah died 3 years earlier. Claire sat down with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale under the porch light, and for a long stretch of time she simply stared out at the dark rows of vines, breathing like someone who had finally been given permission to breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs for the first time in months. Somewhere behind us, faint music still drifted from the reception, and neither of us moved to go back toward it. Finally, she asked me why I'd done it, and I didn't have a clean answer ready for her, only a true one. I told her about the fire, about Sarah, about the particular kind of stillness that settles permanently over a man who once failed to move fast enough when it actually counted, and how watching her hands go rigid on that white tablecloth had lit up every nerve in my body that still remembered exactly what being trapped felt like from the inside. She was quiet a long moment, turning something over in her mind, then told me her own truth in return, that her father's hardware business had been drowning for 2 years straight, that Preston had quietly paid off the worst of the debt 6 months earlier without her knowledge or her consent, and that tonight's proposal had never really been a question so much as a bill finally coming due, one she was expected to pay off with the rest of her life, installment by installment, smile by rehearsed smile. I asked her, carefully, whether she loved him at all, and she laughed, a short, brittle sound with no real humor left inside it, and said love had stopped being part of the arithmetic a long time before tonight ever arrived. She said her father didn't know how to look her in the eye anymore, that her mother had died 3 years earlier believing Preston was a good match for her only daughter, and that disappointing everyone who still remembered her mother's quiet hopes for her felt like holding a second funeral she wasn't ready or willing to attend. I told her I understood more about carrying somebody else's expectations than she probably realized standing there, and I meant every word of it, though I didn't explain the exact shape mine had taken yet, not that night. She noticed the pocket watch anyway, the chain catching the porch light when I shifted my weight on the step, and asked me, quietly, almost shy about it, what the engraving said. I told her about my father, about the word "stand when it matters," engraved along the inside of the case in his own cramped handwriting, about the night of the fire when I'd finally understood exactly what those 5 words had been quietly preparing me for all along, whether I'd wanted the lesson or not, and whether I'd asked for it or not either. She turned the watch over once in her own hands, before giving it carefully back. Like she understood already, it wasn't a thing to be borrowed lightly or held on to for longer than she'd earned the right to. Something passed between us in that small exchange that neither of us named out loud that night, an agreement with no contract behind it and no witnesses beyond the two of us sitting on that quiet porch, that whatever came next in the following days, neither of us intended to let the other one walk back into that reception hall, or into whatever waited beyond it, entirely alone ever again, not while either of them still had breath left to say otherwise. By the time the vineyard had gone fully dark and the band inside had finally packed up its equipment for the night, we had built something neither of us could honestly call a plan, more a promise stitched together loosely out of two people who recognized the same particular kind of exhaustion in each other's faces. She would go home in the morning to face her father across the same kitchen table she'd grown up eating breakfast at, the one with the water ring near the edge that neither of them had ever bothered to sand out. I would go back to stringing lights and repairing fences and sanding tabletops like nothing unusual had happened at all, though we both understood by then, without saying it, that nothing was going back to how it had been even one single day earlier, no matter how ordinary tomorrow tried to look from the outside. She thanked me at the guest house door, formal and careful, like she wasn't sure yet what kind of thanks a night like that one actually required of her, and I told her she owed me nothing, which was true, and also, I would learn much later, not entirely the whole truth of the matter. I drove home that night with the pocket watch turning over and over in my jacket pocket, replaying the look on Preston Cole's face in the moment his laugh hadn't managed to reach anywhere near his eyes, and I understood, without being able to prove a single word of it yet, that a man like that does not simply absorb a public humiliation in front of 200 people and let it fade quietly into memory. Men like Preston keep a ledger, and I could tell just by the set of his shoulders as we walked away that mine had already opened to a fresh page. Claire had asked me, right before I left her standing at that door, what was supposed to happen now that the whole county had watched us walk out together into the dark, and I hadn't had a real answer ready for her then, because I genuinely did not know what we had just started between us, only that neither one of us could take it back now, and that some part of me, the part that had been asleep for 3 long years since the fire, badly wanted to stay awake long enough to find out. Claire came back to Cedar Hollow 4 days later, driving up the gravel road in her father's old sedan with an excuse about checking on wedding decor that nobody had actually asked her to return for, and I let her keep the excuse because I understood by then that some visits need a cover story to feel permitted at all, even to the person making them. I was up on a ladder repairing a section of trellis that had sagged under an early frost, and she stood below holding the wire spool for me without being asked, the way a person does when they already know their way around usefulness, even if nobody taught them the specific job. We didn't talk about the wedding, or Preston, or any of it, not that afternoon. We talked about the vines instead, which grapes were close to ready, and which needed another 2 weeks of sun, and I watched some of the tightness leave her shoulders for the first time since I'd met her, like the vineyard itself was doing something the guest house porch alone hadn't quite managed to do. She came back the following week, and then the week after that, always with some fresh, thin reason, a casserole dish to return, a question about a caterer's contract nobody had actually assigned her, until we both quietly stopped pretending the reasons mattered at all to either of us anymore. I taught her how to read a grape by feel instead of by sight, the particular give of ripe skin under a light thumb press, and she laughed for the first time in my hearing, a real laugh, surprised out of her like it had been sitting locked up somewhere for far longer than she'd realized it had been. She told me she hadn't laughed like that since before her mother got sick, and then she looked almost embarrassed at having said it out loud to a man she'd known less than a month, like the sentence had slipped out of her before she'd had the chance to catch it and put it away again, back where she usually kept things like that, hidden. It was on one of those afternoons that she noticed the pocket watch again, working itself loose from my shirt pocket as I reached up into the trellis wire, and this time she asked to hold it properly, turning it over slowly under the autumn light to read the engraving one more time, like she was memorizing it for herself instead of just reading it. She asked whether I still believed what it said, and I told her I was trying to, that some days standing up was easier than others, that grief has a way of making a man doubt every instinct he used to trust without a second thought behind it. She told me, quietly, that she envied me having a phrase like that to hold on to, something solid enough to actually touch when the ground underneath her own life kept shifting without warning or permission from her. I didn't have an answer ready for that, only the watch itself, which I let her keep a little longer than I strictly needed to that particular afternoon, watching her thumb trace the letters again and again. Meanwhile, across town, Preston Cole had not been idle, and I should have expected that faster than I did, given everything Claire had already told me about the particular shape of his pride and how little of it had survived that reception intact. He started with small things at first, the kind that don't look like an attack until you step back and see the whole pattern laid out clean in front of you. A canceled cabinet order here, a long-time client who suddenly preferred another carpenter there, a lumber supplier who stopped returning my calls about an order I'd already put a deposit down on weeks earlier. I chalked the first two up to ordinary bad luck, the kind every small business absorbs occasionally without much explanation, because I still wanted, foolishly maybe, to believe a grown man could lose a public moment gracefully in front of his neighbors and simply move on with the rest of his life, the way I had spent 3 years trying to do with my own losses. By the third canceled order, I stopped believing in luck entirely, the way you stop believing in coincidence once it starts arriving on a fixed schedule, regular as an invoice. My cousin, who tended bar 2 nights a week at the same tavern Preston favored, mentioned offhand that Preston had been telling a version of the wedding story where I'd cornered him, threatened him in front of witnesses, humiliated a good man trying to do right by a woman he loved and had every intention of protecting. It wasn't the truth, not one single word of it, but it was a story with real momentum behind it, told by a man with 3 development projects and a Chamber of Commerce seat, and stories like that don't need to be true to spread through a county this size. They only need a teller. People already trust more than they trust the quiet caretaker who strings lights for a living and rarely says much of anything in his own defense. Claire's father received a phone call that same week, polite and businesslike on the surface, reminding him that the remaining balance on his debt to Preston's family holdings could technically be called due in full at the lender's discretion, a detail buried in fine print. None of them had thought twice about when the original arrangement was made 2 years earlier during a much harder season for the family. Nothing about the call was a threat exactly, nothing you could point to and call illegal outright, just a reminder, delivered with excruciating politeness, of exactly how much leverage a man like Preston still held over a family that had once trusted him without question or hesitation. Claire told me about the call with her hands shaking slightly around her coffee cup, and I understood, watching her, that this was never going to be a fight fought with fists or shouting, but with paperwork, whispers, and precisely timed reminders of who owed whom what and when it might come due. A war fought entirely in the quiet, careful language powerful people reserve for each other. I kept working through it, kept stringing lights and fixing trellises and sanding the same tabletop for a customer who hadn't yet canceled, because stopping felt like conceding something I wasn't ready to concede. Not yet. Maybe not ever again in my life if I could help it. Claire kept coming back too, more often now, staying later into the evenings than either of us planned, and something between us had shifted from careful distance into something neither of us named out loud, but both of us protected fiercely, guarding it the way you guard a small flame cupped against a wind determined to put it out. I noticed she'd started folding her napkin into a tight, perfect square whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near her father's finances, a nervous habit I recognized easily because I did something similar myself, running my thumb along the pocket watch's worn edge whenever old grief surfaced without warning at all, uninvited as ever. Then, on a Thursday evening in late October, Claire arrived at the vineyard pale and out of breath, having driven straight from town without calling ahead first the way she usually did out of habit and courtesy. She told me Preston had spent the better part of that week quietly gathering signatures from local business owners, a petition demanding the Town Commerce Council revoke the permits on my carpentry workshop, citing, in the careful language his lawyer had clearly drafted for him, concerns about the character and conduct of persons operating businesses within town limits. It wasn't just my livelihood he was reaching for anymore. It was my name, my standing, the last quiet corner of dignity I had left after 3 years of being the man nobody in town looked at directly, and he intended, as far as either of us could tell that night, to take every last piece of it from me in public, in front of the whole county, where I would have no way left to defend myself quietly. The Commerce Council met in the same banquet hall where Preston had once knelt in front of 200 wedding guests, folding chairs replacing the round tables now, a podium set up at the front where the string quartet used to play that autumn evening. Every seat was full that night, farmers and shop owners, and half the wedding guests who'd witnessed the proposal months earlier, all drawn by the same rumor circling town for weeks, that the quiet caretaker from Cedar Hollow was finally getting what had been coming to him for a long while. I sat near the front with my lawyer, a young woman named Denise, who worked mostly wills and property closings, and had never handled anything remotely like this in her career, and I kept my hands flat against my own knees so the room wouldn't watch them shaking under the table. Claire sat 2 rows behind me beside her father, close enough that I could hear her breathing change the moment Preston stood, and I understood without turning around that she already knew what he intended to say before he opened his mouth in front of the crowd. Preston stood when the chair opened the floor, dressed like he was attending a funeral for somebody he respected, and began by saying he only wanted to protect the character of businesses operating in this town. Then he turned toward me, in front of the entire room, and said my late wife's death had never actually been fully investigated, that the fire marshal's report left questions open that a man with my temperament might not want asked in public. The room made a sound I still hear sometimes, a collective intake of breath, 200 people leaning forward at once toward a wound that was never theirs to open. I could not speak. My throat had closed around 3 years of grief, and I sat there feeling every eye in that hall pressing into the scar on my jaw, watching a private wound get turned, in a single careless sentence, into a weapon aimed straight at whatever future I had left to protect. Denise's hand found my forearm under the table, steadying, but I could not have found a word to say if my life had depended on it right then. Claire stood up from the back row before I could find my own voice, her chair scraping loud against the floor, and told the room, clearly and without a single tremor, that she had seen the fire marshal's full report herself, and that it closed the case as an accident with no ambiguity left in it at all. Preston turned on her instantly, his composure slipping for the first time all night, calling her ungrateful, calling her dishonest with her own father, saying she'd let a stranger's charity cloud her judgment about a family that had supported her for years. The room turned toward Claire the way it had turned toward me only a moment earlier, hungry for whatever came next, and I watched her father, sitting 3 rows back, drop his eyes to his own folded hands, like a man ashamed of a debt he had never quite finished paying off. Somewhere behind me, a woman I didn't recognize whispered loud enough to carry, "That girl always did think she was better than her raising," and I felt Claire flinch at the words, without turning around to find whoever had said them. Preston reached into his jacket then and produced a folded document, holding it up like a trump card he'd been saving all evening, claiming it proved I had pressured Claire's father financially, offering to quietly cover his debt in exchange for Claire's affection, a transaction dressed up to look like rescue. He read 2 lines aloud, his voice rising for the first time that night, and the room erupted into overlapping questions, half the crowd on their feet. My name and Claire's name tangled together in noise. I couldn't separate into anything I could answer. The council chair banged a gavel twice, and it did nothing at all to quiet anyone. Voices kept climbing over each other, Preston's paper still raised over his head like a flag he intended to plant somewhere permanent. My name and Claire's name repeated back and forth across the crowded room until the two blurred into a single accusation. Finally, the chair stood up herself, both hands lifted high for quiet, and the whole room, slowly and unwillingly, began to settle back into its seats, waiting. I sat there with my whole future balanced on a folded sheet of paper I had never once seen before that night, in a room that had already half decided, before a single fact had been checked or verified by anyone with actual authority, exactly which one of us it wanted to believe, and exactly which one of us it was finally ready to cast out for good. Claire reached across the empty chair between us and took my hand, and neither of us let go. Claire stood again before the chair could restore full order, her phone already in her hand, and said she had something the council needed to see before anyone voted on anything Preston had presented that night. She walked to the front on legs I could tell were shaking under that green dress she'd worn since the wedding, without either of us noticing the coincidence until later, and she set her phone down on the podium, screen up, for the chair and two council members to read for themselves in silence. They were messages from Preston to her father, 6 months of them, laying out in his own careless words exactly how the debt relief had been offered as leverage toward the marriage, and one message, sent the same week as the hearing, instructing her father's own bookkeeper to prepare the very document Preston had waved over his head only minutes earlier. Claire's father stood next, without being asked, his voice unsteady in a way I had never once heard from him before that night, not even at his own wife's funeral 3 years earlier, when everyone expected him to break. He told the room, plainly and without excuse, that he had let shame keep him quiet for 2 years, that the debt had never been the generous gesture Preston made it sound like at every chamber event since, and that he was done, effective that evening, allowing his own daughter to pay for his mistakes with the rest of her life. He apologized to Claire directly, in front of the whole room, his voice cracking on her name, and she crossed the floor without hesitation and took his hand in both of hers. Preston's composure did not survive the second document. He shouted that the messages were taken out of context, that nobody in that room understood the nuance of a private arrangement between grown adults, and his voice climbed until it cracked on the word arrangement itself, loud and raw in a way his practiced calm had never once allowed before that night. The room, which had leaned toward him only 20 minutes earlier, leaned away from him now, chairs creaking as 200 people quietly recalculated who deserved their trust. The council voted to reject the zoning complaint entirely and referred Preston's conduct to the county ethics board within the same 10 minutes, a formality that felt, in that crowded room, like watching a man's whole reputation come apart in real time in front of people who used to envy him. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of room, and Claire's father had asked quietly that it not become one. But I watched shoulders loosen all around me, watched neighbors who had signed his petition only weeks earlier avoid each other's eyes now, ashamed of how easily they had been led by a smile and a well-timed folder. Claire found me afterward in the parking lot, away from the last of the crowd still lingering by the doors, and she didn't say anything about the hearing at all. She said she was done being careful with a life that was hers to spend, and that she was choosing me, plainly, with no audience left to perform for, and nothing left to prove to anyone but herself. I didn't have a speech ready. I only had the pocket watch, which I put into her hand and closed her fingers around, telling her it was hers now, since she'd earned the right to decide what standing up looked like for herself from here on out, on her own terms, at her own pace. I drove home that night with an empty passenger seat and a fuller chest than I'd carried in 3 long years, past the same billboards and the same dark fields, understanding for the first time since the fire that being seen standing up for somebody was not the same thing as being punished for it after all. Sometimes a man gets both the cost and the reward handed to him in the very same season, close enough together that it takes a while to notice neither one has canceled the other one out. A year later, the wooden sign at the entrance to Cedar Hollow Vineyard reads, Halloway and Whitfield, freshly repainted. My own hands on the brush this time, instead of somebody else's charity, since the owners offered me a stake in the property once word of that hearing traveled the whole county. Claire runs the events side of the vineyard now, booking the same kind of weddings that once made me the invisible man, working the edges of somebody else's happiness. Except she makes certain every caretaker, every server, every quiet person keeping the lights running gets introduced by name to the guests before the first toast is ever poured. A small rule she made without asking anyone's permission. The string lights I wired through the oaks 2 autumns ago still hang there, repaired every spring with my own 2 hands, and they lit our own small wedding this past June under those same branches, a fact neither of us has ever quite gotten over saying out loud to each other at breakfast. The town that used to look past me now stops me by name at the hardware store and the post office, and I won't pretend that shift didn't take some real getting used to after 3 years of being treated like furniture nobody bothered to greet. Preston Cole sold his remaining development lots within the year and moved 2 counties over, and I've only heard secondhand how things have gone for him since, which is exactly how much of my attention I intend to keep spending on the subject for the rest of my life. Claire's father comes to Sunday dinner most weeks now, steadier than I've ever once seen him, and he always brings a bottle of wine from whichever section of the vineyard he claims tastes closest to the harvest the year everything nearly fell apart on all of us at the same time, a private joke between the 2 of us that Claire still hasn't fully caught on to. Claire still folds her napkin into a tight, perfect square out of old habit whenever a hard conversation drifts anywhere near money or family, and most nights now she catches herself mid-fold, laughs quietly at her own hands, and pulls the corners back open on purpose. A small private signal between the 2 of us that whatever fear just passed through her has already passed on through and out the other side. I keep the pocket watch in a drawer by our bed these days, not because it stopped mattering to me, but because I finally stopped needing to hold on to it every single hour of every single day just to remember what it had spent a lifetime teaching me. Some lessons, once learned all the way down to the bone, stop needing the object that first carried them into you. Though, I will admit, I still open that drawer more often than I probably need to. If you have ever been the person standing quietly at the edge of somebody else's happiness, wondering whether you were even allowed to move at all, I would genuinely like to know in the comments what finally got you standing up out of that chair, because I have come to believe more of us are carrying that exact story around than any of us ever say out loud to another living soul. I will leave you with the only thing I know for certain after everything that happened that autumn at Cedar Hollow, that love worth having never once needs to corner a single person into accepting it, and that the bravest thing a person can do on most ordinary days is simply refuse to stay seated when the thing happening right in front of them is wrong, whether anybody ever thanks them for standing up or not.